A good contract is worth its weight in gold. Are you a creative entrepreneur who contracts your services to others? Well, listen up, because this is for you. The Smithers Law Group has created 14 master contracts specifically for creative entrepreneurs. These contracts are industry specific, they're fully customizable, and you only pay a one-time fee. This is so much better and more affordable than speaking with an attorney who's going to charge you an hourly consultation fee, and it's so much more secure than just Googling up your contract and hoping for the best. Find your fully customizable and industry-specific contract at stulawgroup.com. Search for the contract link. And don't forget to tell them that I sent you.
Don't be a grasshopper trapped in a jar with the lid off.
Ooh.
And the reason
Too dumb to know that you could just look up and jump out. Dang.
Right. Because I think that's kind of in some ways what we're talking about. Like, if you're, and I'll just take African Americans because I think that like I said, for a long time, we have been in the jar with the lid on. But I think when it is taken off, we have to be able to realize that we're now free. We're now free to reach for our dreams. We're now free to achieve our goals. We're now free to raise our children. We're now free to live in our neighborhoods. We're now free.
Repeat after me. I bring more than diversity. I bring irreplaceable perspectives. Hey friends, my name is Whitney, and I'm the host of Impostrix Podcast, the show that validates professionals of color navigating imposter syndrome and racial toxicity in their career. Join us and be validated. You got this. Welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. I have a special episode today because this is the first time that I'm speaking to a family member on the show. And so I am welcoming my brother, Dr. Jord Knox, onto the show. And I'm super excited. One, because we have a lot of informal conversations, and well, this will be informal, but we have a lot of conversations about what's happening in the world around us. But I have not yet, like I said, had any family members on. And my brother and I actually have differing opinions. So this will be an interesting episode. And I'm interested, once you hear the episode, I want to know what listeners think about, either what my perspective is or what Dr. Jordan Knox's perspective is. So, So, Jordan, introduce yourself. Who are you?
So I am Whitney's brother. I live in Seattle, Washington, where we grew up. And I think that I'm a college professor. I work at Nordstrom in the corporate lobby, and I am essentially trying to make things happen, just as, I'm sure everyone listening to the podcast is. We're always, looking at where we're at and trying to get to where we want to be and doing all the things that we can do to succeed. So I'm just thrilled that Whitney has put together this podcast, and it's been so successful. And I'm so grateful to be invited on the show.
Thank you, Jordan. So Jordan is my older brother. We also have a sister, Curry, who is my twin, for those that don't know. And yeah, we all are in different locations in the U.S. And so now I don't get to see y'all as much as I would like, but it's nice to see you on the screen. So we're going to jump in, and today's conversation is going to be about race, and not only race, what race is and what it means in our society, but also we're going to talk about how both of us see our society moving forward as we navigate race, racial discrimination, racism, and injustice in the U.S. and, maybe more broadly. So the first question that I want to ask, and I guess to provide some background, Jordan teaches one of the courses that you teach, Jordan, is what, African American studies or?
Introduction to Diversity in the Africana American Studies Department.
Okay, awesome. And so he's written a couple of papers, and one on race itself. And so I'll make sure to link that into the show notes. But so we're going to start out by just talking about what you've learned in your studies about the origin of race, the origin of Blackness. And yeah, so I would love for you to share with us about your paper and about your studies.
Sure. So when I was, this really started for me as a doctoral student. Um, I just had all these questions after having, lived a fairly, I would say non-eventful in some sense. Like I didn't really have, you know, as much trauma as maybe some other Black men that I knew. But I certainly had my share of things that unfolded in the course of me trying to get my education, trying to get a good job, moving across the country. And basically, it all revolved around me having these questions about where race, how race originated, and where um, did we find the need, or when did we find the need to categorize each other based on our skin color, our phenotype, which are our physical characteristics. And so I did some research into that. I found basically what a fossil tells us is what the oldest, or the date of where it is, what human piece that they find. It gives you so much information about where it comes from, how that ancestor lived, what was the characteristics of the environment that they lived in. And so basically, when I found this article on this fossil from Ethiopia, I realized, due to all my other articles that I had pulled into the paper that I'm writing, that this had to be the oldest human fossil ever discovered. It was only in 2009 that it was discovered. And so, how this kind of links to race is, if we all came out of Africa and that happened, 4.4 million years ago was the oldest fossil, then it also makes sense that later in time, I think in the 100 to 200,000 year ago range, we descended, many of us, from a sub-Saharan African population to um, colonize Eurasia. And basically what that means is, like, people who had dark skin, like me and you, Whitney, they moved from where they would have been in sub-Saharan Africa, many of them, to a northern part of the world where there wouldn't have been a lot of UV. And so because of this, they over time lost the pigmentation in their skin that would have, called melanin, that would have made them darker um, in appearance, in their skin color. And they lost some of those characteristics that we had because of the UV that we um, were and still, um, uh, you know, get as part of our environment. And so I guess where I'm going with this is, the important part to remember is that from 1 AD to the 1600s, which is when race was kind of coined or invented, um, there was not really such a thing. There was only such a thing of long distance travel like that from about 1 AD to about um, the 16. I mean, well, till now, of course, but that's kind of why it's important in terms of like the slave trade and all of these other global events that happened where colonization occurred and people were discriminated against, and also there were systems of injustice that were developed. Um, and this is all kind of tying into the development of the concept of race, because before that, even though we would have had theoretically, different skin colors, we would have lived in um, neighboring environments where we wouldn't have been able to travel so far. And so that's why 180 to 1600 is really important in this whole conversation about race, because it's the time frame um, when long distance travel would have theoretically actually been possible. And so before that, we probably wouldn't have had very much movement around the globe, um, so that we could discover or see people who didn't look different, the same as us.
Hey, y'all. So let's switch gears for just a minute. We talk so much about empowerment of folks of color on this show. And now I want to take a second to talk about our legacy. It's so important that as we're out here doing our thing and making that money and trying to be the people that we want to be for our communities and families, that we get our estate plan together. And I know estate planning can be overwhelming. We've got your back. Our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Wills for the People is an estate planning practice that prioritizes creating and advancing generational wealth, particularly within families of color and middle-class families. This is because it's so important that we just get started. So, what do you want your legacy to be? And what steps have you taken to ensure that that happens? Take those steps with Wills for the People, where intentional planning meets transformative results. Visit our website for your free consultation at willsforthepeoplega.com. Mention Impostrix Podcast and we'll give you 10% off of your package. All right, I'll see you over there. Let's get back to the show. Right. And so it's my understanding that race as a construct was developed with the transcontinental slave trade. Blah. That race was developed with the slave trade. Is that right? Or at least maybe
Well,
with the arrival of
yeah, it
Africans.
could have been the Spanish Inquisition, which was another point in history where um, it was basically a war. But essentially, they were fighting. Um, it was somewhere between religion and race. But yes, the first big act of, I don't know, injustice, oppression, um, was really that transatlantic slave trade that was pinned, or that was that solely was based on race.
Okay. So in my studies, what I've learned and what I believe is essentially that Africans were brought to the United States, to what is now the United States, back then, what would become the colonies, for, of course, slavery. And at the time that they were brought, there was already a caste system, if you will, in the colonies, not the United States, where there was the separation, or the maybe oppressive structure was based less on what we actually look like, but more on the wealth that we had, and the class that we fell into. So there was the owner class, who were the people that would become plantation owners and slave owners. And then there were indentured servants, who were also European white people, who were lower class and who did a lot of the work that slaves would take on. And they became the overseers. And then once the slave trade started, and Africans were brought over, there was slavery, and there were indigenous folks who, of course, as we know, were pushed from one land to another land. But I believe that comes a little bit later in our history. And so my understanding is that the construct of race, of blackness, Negro, and whiteness was a construct that was developed in order to differentiate between classes of indentured servants and the enslaved Africans that were brought over. And that now carries to modern day, where people who look like me and you are considered black. People with fair skin of European ancestry are considered white. And then, the whole slew of people from other countries and heritage, people from the Asian diaspora, people from the Latin American diaspora, etc. Is that also your understanding?
Uh, yes. I would say that the only thing that um, I would add to that is that um, there was the outside influence of Europe, or well, the UK, in terms of the Revolutionary War. That's all true with regard to the slave trade, but then there was also, um, the Revolutionary War, which would have been really about, like you said, taxation, and how the British East India Company um, had basically not been taxed for tea from China, although other things were taxed. And it sounded to me in my studies like, that was the lead up to, the USA, and everything kind of spiraled from there. I would also say that it's not my understanding that race isn't necessarily an American concept. I think it's more of like a European concept that really got its origins and foundation in Europe, um, in like the 1600s or the late 1500s, and was just kind of transplanted with everything else that came over here. So that's kind of the only two caveats that I would add.
Yeah. Okay. And so now, we're fast forwarding. We know that there have been now 400 years of oppression, of racism, of racialization of people, and peoples here in the United States, to the effect that although race is literally just words, that were made up to differentiate between one person and another, that the effect of these words can be dire, can be life or death for some people, can mean access to things like money and wealth and property and education for some, and can mean, you know, or can contribute, I guess, to generational poverty, can mean over criminalization, can mean increased punishment in schools and in education, can mean shorter lifespans and lower positive health outcomes for people. And so I think, to get to the meat of the conversation, the point where you and I diverge what as far as this race issue is really on what do we do? How do we move forward um, to create a world where race doesn't mean anything? And when I say doesn't mean anything, what I mean is where one's race is not going to determine access or outcomes. And
Right.
so I would love for you to just share your perspective as to how we move forward. And then I'll share mine, and then we can talk about the differences and where we align. Um, and that.
Yeah, sure. So I just, I'll start with the, we all kind of know about the civil rights movement. We know about, as you said, all of the injustice that happened to not only African American community, but people of color in general, and how they responded. Mostly nonviolent, very peaceful protests and demonstrations, um, but were met with brutal and um, sometimes lethal force um, on the hand by the hands of segregationists and white people that didn't want this to happen, the integration and the things that would come later. And so, as you said, that really left a lot of inequitable outcomes. But I think with the rise of the Black Power movement, a lot of African Americans felt that those demonstrations were actually successful because integration happened and things like Reconstruction even happened after the Civil War, even though that was not it was not by any means finished or by any means what they had promised that it would be. But I think that means that there has actually been some progress. I do think that in terms of the Black Power movement, the reason I bring that up is because there was kind of um, this paradox or paradigm kind of like between should we continue in a nonviolent fashion or should we take more violent coordinated action. And I think in my article I talk about how the Black Panther Party, certain elements of it, kind of lost a little bit of their popularity, I would say, at the time because of some of the violent things that happened um, to, just regular people that were part of kind of their strategy of doing what they were doing. And And to be honest, I think it was not seen as a viable strategy to secure civil rights. In the end, I think the peaceful protests and demonstrations were much more effective. But I do, and this is one thing I don't talk about in my article, there's also a lot of gang activity that occurred after that, where, it was really focused on you know, violence in the African American community and violence between, specific gangs that were then integrated. Because even though maybe the jails were not necessarily quite as integrated, because the inmates had to, um, those who were incarcerated had to stay in areas where they felt safe, and that might have led to some self segregation. But I think on the streets, a lot of those gangs were integrated. And unfortunately, that's a part that I don't really talk about. But to get to the point of kind of our conversation is that, okay, you had, the gang violence and the crack epidemic and all of these other things that happened in the neighborhoods across the country. And And you saw, like you said, the inequitable outcomes for certain groups of people, whether or not they were, uh, whether or not, they were, um, from one place or another, it seemed to be a pattern. And so, what I think, in my perspective, needs to happen um, with regard to race, as you said, like, how do we move forward from here? Is that we have to separate those problems from race, because in my opinion, race is what got us to where we are. And for the last, from 1 AD or 1600 to now, we've had race. From 180 to 1600, we really haven't had anything that resembled race. Now, we may have had other forms of oppression, like class-based oppression, like you said, or other things that may have resembled um, certain other types of, globalized or barbarians and civilized, or whatever it may have been, but we did not have race. And so my thing is, I think race is a precursor for people to then say, okay, because I can say that you're black, I have these stereotypes about black people. I'm going to write laws that then impact, you know, black people in these ways. Even if I don't say it's black people, I know what the statistics look like, and I know what the geography looks like, and so I can manipulate it. And that's in addition to me not really caring for or believing in, people of color, you know. And so I think that is what I'm trying to get at. And I think if the only way that you can really get at that with people using like veiled, very like, the difference between de facto and de jure discrimination, very veiled attempts to get people of color to have these outcomes that you've described. Um, it's not always like you can pinpoint exactly, you know, what is driving them, and their motivations are not always clear, because we just live in a world where half the time we're not even face to face. We don't know, even if we were face to face, if I come into your restaurant and you're just having a bad day and I have bad service and I'm black and you're white, then I can't necessarily assume that because of that that you are somehow being racist to me. However, if I vote with my dollars and I say, you know what, even though I can't assume, because there's been a pattern of black people and white people in this restaurant, and I hear from other black people who have said I have a similar experience, then I think the most effective way to stop that is with your dollars. Do not eat at that restaurant. Do not tip that waiter, that kind of thing. For same in politics. If, you don't appreciate someone and what they're saying or doing, vote them out. Vote for another candidate. Run yourself. These are all options that we have that don't require us to necessarily categorize ourselves in the same ways that have been used, quite frankly, to, discriminate against us. And how can someone then discriminate against us at many of the entry points into these jobs, professions, um, restaurants, I guess is different, but uh, even, in the political realm, if they don't know, if we just come across as a human being and not as necessarily a black person. And that's kind of my idea about how we proceed, because I'm not sure that more identity is actually going to give us the result that we're looking for.
And is that because you feel, or maybe let me just ask, why is that? Why don't you think that identity is going to give us the result? Because it sounds to me as though it's almost like a triggering effect. And the reason I
Mm,
say that is because of what you said about the Black Power movement and
mm,
the way that the Black Power movement was abrasive in many
mm,
respects. In some respects, they
mm.
weren't. They are responsible
Yeah,
for free food drives,
me,
soup kitchens,
yeah,
and stuff like that,
yeah.
school lunches. But in some
Mm,
ways, they were abrasive, and obviously, any human,
Mm,
regardless of race, is going to have a certain reaction and a different
right.
reaction to abrasiveness versus non-abrasiveness. So I'm wondering, like, what about the maybe increased identity, if you will, do you think is going to be problematic for us moving forward?
Yeah. I think it comes back to what I was saying about we can power concedes nothing. So the way I look at it is, you know, and also we're in such a digital world now that I just feel like it's very difficult to tell a person's intentions if they don't come out and tell you them. You know, I mean, you would have to literally do a lot of field work, and what I mean by field work is gathering complaints from similar looking people. You know, you'd have to um, you'd have to do a lot of work to figure out whether or not any of it was actually true. And in the way that our society is structured, it would be time would be very important because, you know, any any kind of effort to understand any kind of social phenomena, as you've said, race is a social construct, takes a lot of time. And it takes, you know, as someone who's recently written a dissertation, you know, you have to come up with a survey and ask interview questions. And and you know, if you did that for every single, you know, person that you felt, or organization that you felt, or politician that you felt was not what you thought they should be, or if they were acting um, in a racist way, or, you know, whatever the case may be, that's a lot of work. And unfortunately, you know, we live in a society that is very much driven by time. And so we need things like that, and we need it, you know, now. And it's never as good later as it is now, you know. And so I just feel like we just need, you know, if that's the case, you know, why is it so important for us, you know, if time is money, to, I'm not going to say waste our time, but I don't see it as being as effective as withholding the money from the tip. Because if enough people withhold that money, then, you know, that restaurant owner is going to have to think about, well, is there something wrong with me? Is this the reason why I'm coming off as so abrasive to these people of color, or this black person that's coming into my restaurant that wants to get something to eat, and maybe they've had a long day too? And why is it that I'm not getting tips from them, but I'm getting tips from others? You know what I mean? And so, to me, and the same thing goes in politics. If a certain candidate can't get the black vote, then, you know, maybe there's something that that candidate is saying that's racist. And so maybe we don't need to vote for him. Maybe we vote for the other person. You know, so those are things that I think should be more taken maybe seriously. I think we do take them seriously, but I think in a democracy where we're always doing those things, it becomes kind of mundane. But we just really need to focus on that, in my opinion. The studies and the interviews and the research and all of the mobilizing that it takes to really almost overthrow some of these institutions, in my view, it almost hardens people's perspectives against whatever you're doing. Um, Unfortunately, that's just the way that people often view it. They say, oh, I haven't had that experience with this restaurant. And so then it becomes, us versus them, instead of a restaurant owner thinking to themselves, well, if I can't get this business, then I might have to close my doors. So what do I need to do internally to change my systems to make sure that everyone is okay when they come eat here?
Yeah, I see a lot of truth from my own experience in what you're saying, as far as the hardening of other people who maybe I'm pushing against, or movements that I'm involved in are pushing against,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the um, practicality and also the effectiveness of like financial boycotts, and
Mm-hmm.
even as recently as boycotting certain companies that were funding the genocide in Gaza, and seeing
Mm-hmm.
the effect of that kind of withholding from money. And every year, once it's Black Friday, and the withholding
Yeah.
of black dollars during Black Friday
Right.
and stuff like that, like I do get that. I think where I differ from your opinion is just feeling like, if we are not doing a thing that is specifically identifying race as the the transgression, or racism, I guess I should say, as the transgression, then how is anybody going to know? So taking, and when I mean anybody, I mean the person that is committing the harm. How are they going to
Mm-hmm.
know? Because the mindset that they're approaching this in, I don't have faith that that mindset is a place of actual, not even objectivity. I don't want objectivity. I want scrutiny. Like, I want people, white people, but all people who are interacting cross racially, to scrutinize their interactions for bias, for racism, for um, the underlying beliefs, myths, stereotypes that they hold, but may not even necessarily be aware of. And so I don't necessarily have the faith that, without taking your restaurant example,
Mm-hmm.
without me saying, I think that I was treated poorly because I'm Black, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that a white waiter or a white restaurant owner is going to even consider that what was involved in this interaction was bias, was myths, was prejudice. Um, and I don't think that because they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, white people or people of the dominant culture,
Mm-hmm.
period. People that are upper class, like, don't have to think about all of the stuff that the rest of us, put up with, or that the rest of us are experiencing, or how the experience impacts us, or down to the language that we use. The last episode that I recorded, we were talking about white people using the term colored and not thinking anything of it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like they don't have to, because it's never going to offend them, if we are not taking racial justice and racial equity personally. And we across the board, not just white people. And so I guess I just don't have enough faith in change occurring, because of how steeped racism and racialization is in our society. And so, in my opinion, the way forward, and I guess if I'm thinking about Malcolm X or MLK, and I know there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of other people, it's not just them two and their
Right.
philosophies, but I'm definitely more the Malcolm X type. Um, and not that I would be violent, but I am, I'm abrasive. I can be. I can be um, matter of fact
Mm-hmm.
about what I'm experiencing or what other people are experiencing. And I do that, and it is risk, and it does take energy, which is another, point that I really agree with you on is
mm,
I feel like, it makes me question, would I be better off mentally, emotionally, spiritually if I did just kind of separate
mhm,
the systemic experiences that I have with race? Like, if I were to completely separate that out, what would that look
mm,
like for me? And I don't know, because I don't know how to walk around without considering that I'm Black, um,
mm,
and what that means. I saw recently on LinkedIn somebody had posted, there was a study done, and it was a study of women and men, and when they're
mm,
walking alone at night, it was a study to show like where their eyes, like where their gaze went. And for
mm,
women, like their gaze was all over the place. For men,
mm,
their gaze was just straight ahead. And
mm,
so the theory from this study was that women are much more vigilant, because
mm,
there's this belief that women are in more danger, if you will, if you're walking alone
mm,
at than men are. And I feel similar. I've been thinking about that study and what would happen if that study were done across races, for Black people, for Asian people, for white people, for Indigenous people, like where our
mm,
eyes would be going. And that's kind of how I feel. Like, I know about my Blackness, and I know what risk my Blackness holds. I know that I have a lot of privilege because I am middle upper class. So there
mm,
are some things that probably just wouldn't happen for me. Like, I don't have to walk alone at night. I could like
mm,
pay for an Uber type of thing. Um,
right.
but I just wonder, because of the experience that I've had in my body and my skin, I am more
Mm,
vigilant. I am looking more for systemic oppression or individual oppression and racism than
mm,
other people. And so I'm left, when I think about what you're talking about in your perspective, I'm left wondering, like, okay, so but how long is that going to take? Like, how long is it going to take? Are my kids, your nephews, going to grow up
mm,
being in any different of society? Um,
mm,
Regardless of what I do or what you do.
mm, mm.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, the way I look at it is, from like I said, from 1 AD to 1600, we would have theoretically been able to travel long distances, which means that we would have, come into contact with people that were not necessarily looking the exact same way that we looked. And while there were maybe other types of oppression, um, you know, we were able to coexist without the concept of race until the 1600s. And so that's my kind of like my thing, is that from the 1600s to now is actually less time than from 1 AD to the 1600s. So I think about the question that you raise about, you know, my nephews as as one where I'm looking at it more for, okay, how, like you said, maybe we have two different perspectives on how to respond moving forward with race. But I'm looking at it from the perspective of how can my what best serves my nephews in their development of themselves. Because the other part of this that we haven't talked about is, while you're doing all of that work to, be abrasive, or however you would characterize that, what is it that you're not focusing on? And that's kind of what I would, wonder about. Like, is it that you're not able to pay attention when you're driving because it's late at night and all you see in your head is like, what if I get pulled over? What if there's, a racist person at this next gas station that kind of messes with me? what if there's this, what if there's that, and you can't even drive, and so you get into an accident that way, or either, you know, you almost, it's like you can't concentrate on the things that you could have been doing on that drive. You could
Right.
have
It's like
been,
that
enjoying the
hypervigilance.
scenery.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
It's
like the
like when
hypervigilance
when you
of the situation and making it,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
And when you have to be vigilant every single moment of your life, and you can't, you don't have a way out of that, um it could almost, to me, be considered a mental illness.
Mm.
And it probably is, because the mind is, I want to say it's a terrible thing to waste, but that would be kind of cliche because that's Stokely Carmichael. But like, you know, it's
But
just
it's
like,
almost, I mean, I hear you, it's the anxiety because I'm somebody,
yeah,
that has anxiety, and
hmm,
I can obsess and obsess and obsess about
yeah,
any random thing. Um,
yeah,
like if we are, focused, and I've heard this, from
hmm,
other people,
hmm,
from Black men, from, Black women, of the kind of like, I don't even have the energy, to do this because
hmm,
it takes a lot of energy. It takes
hmm,
so much energy to show up day in and day out wanting to
hmm,
address racial injustice.
right.
Um, and so I definitely see that.
Yeah, and it's not saying that all of these things should go unaddressed. It's just saying that sometimes, you know, like Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You have to you have to put yourself in a mindset where you have, like you said, you don't have very much faith that people who are not people of color will understand and will scrutinize their own actions. Well, sometimes them you have to put that in their hands.
Mm,
You have to let them be the ones to be more vigilant, because um, having us only be vigilant and always being forceful, that you know like we were saying, it's very detrimental to whatever we are doing in the moment, because now we can't focus on what we wanted to do in the moment, and we can't. I've seen, perfect example, there is a Bollywood movie that I was introduced to by a friend of mine, and it's essentially a similar to the civil rights movement in African American history, where a family that was living in a specific uh, town in England um, was essentially uh, attacked by people who were obviously racist. What the father did was he went and tried to avenge the act, and unfortunately he was put in jail, and the whole thing kind of informed his development later on. And the son was such a great cricket player that he wanted to play for the English team. But about, midway through his career, college career, or whatever cricket team he was on, his dad said, this is one of my things. I'm not letting you play for the English team after what happened to our family. So then this son went and became a shop owner in that area that now the father was like a civil rights leader in. And the story is about how the now an older man found his way back into cricket, um, because he had only kind of been taught to think like Sikh or white, and so he kind of now was able to. He did end up playing for the cricket team against his father's wishes, but his father also realized by the end of the movie that with time, things had actually changed. So what he may have not wanted him to do initially is something that when he did later, you know, it wasn't the same. And even just preventing him from doing that and him becoming a shop owner kind of defeats the purpose of what his father was trying to do when you really think about the context of the movie. And that's kind of what I think is like we may be forfeiting all of these goals because we're so hyper vigilant that we can't even, we don't have the capacity to work on all these other projects because we are bogged down with complaints about the rest of society. But the problem is the rest of society needs to change their ways, not us. And so sometimes you have to put that ball in their court and let them dribble it around and figure out how that feels. And I think it's similar to what you were saying,
Yeah.
but I think it also adds the perspective that all of this is done within a time period. And there can be change that occurs gradually in society. And maybe it won't happen in your son's or um, my nephew's generation, but maybe it does.
Yeah.
I don't think 20 years ago anybody would have said that we had a black president, but we did. We have several black CEOs. It's amazing,
Yeah,
how things have
but
changed.
it's like, because I've been thinking about the black president thing, and
Hmm.
only to the respect of it is great that we had a black president, but like we're never going to recover from that, is how I feel. As far as a country, as far as the world, the just the backlash is
Hmm.
enough to have, I think, changed the trajectory of, you know, where we were headed when Barack Obama would say things like, yes, we can. And I think that it's just, I don't know. It's complex. I don't think there's right or wrongs or, this or that, either or. I think it can be all of the things, and I'm grateful for your perspective because it does. I mean, as I said at the outset, like I think there's a lot that I can relate to with what you're saying around everything, around like sometimes other people got to do the work. It's not my work to do. Sometimes I need to spend my energy doing something else. Um, and I think I still struggle because I don't think that what we're talking about today really applies to what we do when we're faced with a racial aggression. Um,
Hmm.
but I think that that's okay because, there isn't going to be one solution for every
Right.
situation. And in fact, there's many solutions, I think, for any one situation. There's many
Yes.
ways that we can handle things. And I'll say, there are still times where I might experience a racial aggression and choose
Hmm.
that I don't want to spend the energy on it,
Hmm.
because of the acknowledgement of this is my energy at this point. Like me saying something, standing up for myself or, whatever it's going to be may not actually do anything for that other person. Like it may not actually encourage that person to interrogate, you know, what went through their mind when they
Yeah.
decided to say that thing to me. But what it is going to do is get me all riled up. It's going to get my heart pumping. It's going to get me all sweaty and clammy. It's going to get me all upset and all this stuff. Um, and what I can do instead, and what I do sometimes is just take that information, take that feeling, and go back to my community with it. Um, because I think for me, that's the other big piece of the puzzle around racial justice and racial equity work is having the community where there does not have to necessarily be education or explanation, but just like being. And matter of fact, in the episode where the week that we're recording this episode, I released an episode called Black Spaces. that I did with
Mm,
Talib Jasir. And Talib is a man, or Talib, I think I've been saying his name wrong, but he's a man that started a Black podcasting community. And the conversation that we had was just a recognition that there are white spaces and there are Black spaces. And
mm,
being in Black spaces, or being in, maybe not even necessarily racial spaces, but spaces where you can just be, and
mm,
where you can find other people who look like you, or have the interest as you, or the religion as you, or the same disability as you, who you can then bring your stuff to, and like get the feedback, get the advice, get the support, celebrate, and or be in sorrow together. That means so much, both in professional environments but also in our personal lives. And I think that I am somebody that's very pro Black spaces, simply for the healing property that it provides, whether or not we're choosing to kind of push against what we're seeing happening or not, or if we're choosing to maybe push in a different way than the way that I would do it. Um,
mm.
so yeah, I think your perspective is really important in considering, especially for those of us who are like me, who are out in these streets, wanting to talk about race all day long, as just a reminder that sometimes it's not on us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on your show, Whitney. I really appreciate it. And I hope that what we talked about can be expounded upon and followed up with other conversations as well. But this was at least a good starting point for us to kind of get into some of the details about race and racism, and prejudice, discrimination, systemic injustice. All of that is, in my view, um, very unfortunate consequences and unfortunate reality of the world that we live in. And I don't think we should allow it to go unanswered. And so I'm glad that you are doing this work. It's very important conversations to have. My only, kind of my only difference may be that in how we answer.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only difference. I think that we've been given some tools within you know uh, our economic and political system, and even our social system, to address some of this without necessarily um, doing so in ways that could lead to, like you said, a hardening of people's minds and perspectives on into back into their
Yeah.
unfortunate ways. And so I hope that there's can be you know a path where we can, like you said, make decisions, and maybe it's that both ways can happen and should happen,
Mm-hmm.
but that we have to take it on situationally, and we're not doing one every situation or the other. We're using a combination, kind of a mixed methods approach, and that's going to be maybe the most effective for helping us get to a place where we would like to be.
Yeah, I think so. I think our movements, I know of like some, components of movements that do multifaceted approaches
Mhm.
to this type of advocacy and political activism. But then I know movements that don't at all. And I would agree with you that I think a mixed approach, like I do think that the way that we need to teach and engage with people is in a way that they will understand, and that they will be able to be receptive to. And then I believe that there's people that no matter what we do, they're not looking to be different. to experience a change, to experience liberation that encompasses everybody. And so like those people I'm not even talking about. But there are certainly people who would be open if they only knew. And so I think it is a
Right.
matter of making sure that the way that we reach out to these people and the way that we engage with these people is in a way that will actually be impactful for them, recognizing that for some of these people, they're going to shut down if we come at them in certain ways, whereas other people are going to be completely oblivious if we don't come at them at all. Like they just it's going to go right
Yeah.
over their heads.
Right.
So yeah, but thank you. So I like to end my interviews this season asking about the mantra or affirmation that you are relying on this season. And so what is your affirmation or mantra?
Okay, so I would say don't be a grasshopper trapped in a jar with the lid off.
Ooh.
And the reason,
Too dumb to know that you could just look up and jump out. Dang.
Right, because I think that's kind of in some ways what we're talking about. Like, if you're, and I'll just take African Americans because I think that like I said, for a long time, we have been in the jar with the lid on. But I think when it is taken off, we have to be able to realize that we're now free. We're now free to reach for our dreams. We're now free to achieve our goals. We're now free to raise our children. We're now free to live in our neighborhoods. We're now free. And so that's what I would say. Just, if the lid is off, go for
Go
it.
for it. Yeah. We said at the same time, jinx. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. Feel free to continue the conversation with us over on Facebook at the Impostrix Podcast Validating Space. We welcome all, and it's a space for us to validate each other as we work through work, race, and imposter syndrome. You can find out more about me or about the podcast at www.impostrixpodcast.com. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast. Until next time, be validated.